depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our Tuesday live stream about digital transformation. And this topic here today is called 10 Years of Lessons in Enterprise Technology and Digital Transformation. I'm excited for our guest here, who's a returning guest. I'll introduce him in just a moment here. But first, I'll cover a couple of logistical things before I introduce Jon Reed from Diginomica. But before I do that, a couple things. One is we are streaming live to YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So wherever you're joining from today, thank you for being here. And please feel free to pop in the chat any questions you might have as we go through the discussion here today. I've got a few questions I'm going to start with, but would love to hear your thoughts and questions as it relates to sort of where we are today, where we're headed, and how we got to where we are today in the digital transformation and enterprise tech space. So we're excited for this topic here today to really talk about tech trends and whatnot. Secondly, this live discussion becomes part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So if you don't already subscribe to it, we publish new podcast episodes every Wednesday. And these live discussions, which you are part of here today, get edited and polished and combined with other content. And we put together a complete episode based on that. So be sure to check that out. Transformation Ground Control, the podcast, also streams to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And it's also released on audio podcast platforms throughout the world. Lastly, before we introduce our guest, if you could just drop in the chat where you're joining from today, what city and country are you in? I always love to see the global reach and the global community we're chatting with here today, and I'm sure our guest would love to see that as well. And hopefully, those of you in different parts of the world that maybe aren't familiar with our guest will get to know him here today. So please drop in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. I'm here in Denver. I believe my guest is here in Boston, but I'll confirm that here in a moment. But speaking of our guest, to discuss 10 years of lessons in enterprise technology and digital transformation, it's Jon Reed from Diginomica. Jon, thanks for being here today.
Yeah, man, we overcame tech difficulties. It's all downhill from here.
Right, exactly. Yeah, we were kidding before going live here. How many tech guys does it take to get a live stream to work? And we had some significant difficulties, but we are live, so that's the good news. Hopefully, you can all hear us.
Figured out digital transformation. We can't figure out how to get cams going.
Yeah,
It's funny.
can't get our Chrome browsers working and cookies cleared and all that stuff. Sometimes it just comes back to the basics. So part of what stimulated this conversation, Jon, is you've been on the show before. You and I go way back. We've known each other in the space for quite some time. And you and your team at Diginomica recently celebrated the 10-year anniversary of that publication. So maybe before I get to that, Diginomica and what you guys do and sort of what you're seeing in the tech space in terms of trends and all that good stuff, maybe just tell us a little bit about your background. How did you grow up in this space and what's your background?
Yeah, I mean, in the mid '90s, I was looking for a different angle in my career, and I ended up running an ERP recruiting firm. And early on, I realized I was a pretty bad recruiter, but I was pretty good at content. And so I proposed to my owner, let's put out a bunch of content advising people about the market. And we built this pretty big website. We were almost acquired at one point there. But I think the big lesson for me, it was an early preoccupation with things like skills and training. And those things really haven't gone away.
Right.
When you peel back the veneer of project success, it's interesting how jugular those core topics are. Yeah, it sounds kind of mundane in a way, but that you get to the heart of things really there. And then I just learned about the power of community, I guess, and the power of reaching people with like what you might call like authentic content or just being real with stuff, and that can really further relationships. And it's one reason why you and I met and meet so many friends that way. But what you realize is there's a huge power there for customers as well to tap into wisdom and insights beyond company walls. And I think that's been a really major positive trend in the market. On the downside, I think there's still a lot of customers that don't take nearly as much advantage of that as they should. But I think those were like the big light bulb moments. And then things just kind of evolved from there. And it took me a while to kind of grow up in this industry and figure out like exactly what my role should be. And that was the biggest thing about Diginomica was once I aligned myself with that team and founded that publication, that was when I kind of really said, oh, this is finally found my role in this industry, whereas before I was kind of flailing, but I was publishing a whole ton of content, and it was mostly about themes of transformation. There was a lot of ERP, but quite a bit of CRM as well, and that's kind of stuck with it.
Interesting. So that kind of gets back to the genesis of why you started it or why you wanted to start a publication or a media outlet like Diginomica.
Indeed.
Was it to provide that sort of honest, authentic voice in the market? Was that really sort of what you were going for when you guys started Diginomica 10 years ago?
Yeah, I mean there were really two big themes to why we started Diginomica. One was exactly what you described, that we wanted to really document the realities of transformation on the ground and try to figure out how companies are successful and provide more context around that. And obviously we're not the only firm that does that, but there's not that many. You do it, but one thing that we spend a lot of time on is very in-depth customer case studies that we publish that hopefully show like the real challenges as well as the success, because I think that's what's missing from the vendor libraries of studies is they gloss over the hard parts, and so we try to surface a little bit about like the challenges as well. And so that's always been a core. But then the other big thing was just that we wanted to try to build a model for media that wasn't page view driven and and a really crappy reader experience. I mean, if you go on the big tech websites still to this day, you're going to get pop-up videos and all kinds of crap trying to get you to subscribe to this and that, and somewhere buried underneath that is like maybe a piece of content that maybe you can get to. And so we really try to keep, and I actually run our website, we've really tried to keep a clean interface, and we added things like dyslexia mode and audio playback and stuff like that, but that's really more like inclusiveness sort of efforts. But in general, like really try to keep the interface lean, mean, mobile friendly, and like so readers can just really focus on content. And I remember one of our co-founders was like, why am I competing with gadget reviews on tech sites for like hundreds of thousands of page views? I just want to write about what I learned at this NetSuite conference. Like, that was just an example, but surely there's a readership for that, right? And so that
Right.
was kind of our goal, was to try to say there's got to be people that care about this topic as much as we do, and those are the people we try to reach.
Right. What fascinates me about Diginomica, and by the way, I'm just going to pop it on the screen here so everyone can see it, but it's, in case you're not familiar with Diginomica or you don't know how to spell it, it's Diginomica. So diginomica.com. So you can check it out. It's a really good website. And and I've read it, I think, the entire time you guys have been in business, just because I've known you and I knew it. I remember when you started. It doesn't seem like 10 years ago, but apparently it was. I'm going to believe you that it was 10 years ago. It doesn't feel like nearly that long
Oh
ago.
my goodness.
But how have you, over these years, then, this is something that has always fascinated me about you guys, is how have you stayed true to that sort of vision and that mission for what you're trying to accomplish? But at the same time, you do get sponsorships and you have software tech partners and people that pay for sponsorships. How do you balance that? Is that tricky? Is it in conflict at times? The editorial piece of it versus what the vendors want you to say.
It is. And by the way, hi to all the people that are popping in from all over the world. That's really cool. And yeah, Tim, we are a little old, man, but I like to think we're old in like an edgy and helpful way, but you can be the judge. But no, as far as that's concerned, yeah, I mean, so I mean, the good thing was that we had a lot of experience at that point. There were a lot of collective experiences in media and a lot of also failed startups that we'd all had. And so, but one of the things we had clarity on from the beginning is we were going to emphasize disclosures, so that like at the end of every blog post, we list any of our clients that are related to any of the content. And as far as I know, there's still only one other publication in our industry that does that. And so our feeling was like that this industry is very intertwined, and a lot of the financial backroom dealings in this industry are really a little bit creepy. They make you want to kind of take a shower sometimes, and it's like wait, are you a client of Gartner's, like, or are you a client of Forrester's, or like a lot of this stuff isn't very clear. And so we thought, well, we're just going to be clear about what our affiliations are and hope that that readers like say, oh yeah, like I get it. They have an affiliation there, and I'll be the judge of whether that information is helpful or not. And and then of course we try to educate the vendors that are our partners that just because you're our partner doesn't mean we're not going to be critical of you at times. Um, that could be a learning curve. I'll be frank, for some of our partners, they're not used to that.
Mm,
Unfortunately, in our industry, I think there's a perception that if you're a client of someone's that you're going to just talk about how great everything is all the time.
mm,
And what we're trying to do is kind of challenge our industry that doesn't serve anyone's interest. That doesn't help the vendor get better. That doesn't help the customer understand technology. And so, look, we're not perfect, right? But that's the whole reason to disclose is to kind of show here's the financial ties that we have, and then you can be the judge on whether you think the content is relevant to you or not. And so I think for the most part, readers have appreciated that transparency, even if they haven't always necessarily agreed with everything we've written.
right. Yeah, absolutely. And you're the only outlet and website that I know of that can do that. I can't think of anything that's even close in terms of being able to have that edgy, balanced view of the world and realistic view of the world, but at the same time, you do have the sponsorships and that sort of thing. Have you ever, without mentioning names, if it's true, or if the answer to this is yes, have you ever lost a sponsorship or had someone say, "No, I'm just not interested," because if they don't like that model, they don't like the fact that
Yep.
you won't drink the Kool-Aid, you won't.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
I can imagine.
We have lost partners over this, and we have probably lost the opportunity with certain vendors because of that. And that was something that we had to accept. But that was one of the reasons why we bootstrapped Diginomica. This is the other mistake that a lot of smaller media properties have made, is to take venture money and then they run out of runway. And so we bootstrapped it, and that gave us the ability to say, you know what, we don't need to be partners with every firm in this industry to be successful, and that remains the case. And but the good news, and we can kind of get into this a little bit if you want, but I just published this larger piece on reaching informed buyers. But the bottom line is that while buyers aren't perfectly informed, when I compare buyers now to the buyers in the 90s, the buyers now are much more savvy. Their BS detectors are much sharper.
Hmm.
And that's the effect of the online marketplace. Everything from peer reviews to listening to your show to to all this kind of stuff gives buyers more perspective year round. Not if they just make it to a conference. And as a result of that, vendors need to learn how to communicate with buyers differently if they want to be relevant. And so yeah, vendors are willing to embrace the learning curve at times and to figure out a different way to communicate with buyers. And ultimately what we relate to in this industry, I think, is this understanding that none of us are perfect, none of us have all the answers, but we'd all like to have more successful products. I mean, this is one of the biggest themes of your work, is like, why do we have so many failures? And so let's figure it out. That's kind of the big theme, is like, let's put our heads together. Everyone has a voice in this conversation, and let's figure out how to be more successful on our projects.
Right. Yeah, it's well said. And I think rather than burying our heads in the sand and assuming that if we just keep doing things the way we've always done them, surely things will get better, right? Yeah, I think that's the way to address it. I recently had a comment on one of my social media, I think it was on YouTube or something, and you might appreciate this, but I hadn't heard this comment. I have not heard this comment probably in about 10 years, but someone put a comment on challenging me, and it was on a failures related thread or topic, and the person said, "You're absolutely wrong. Digital transformations do not fail at a high rate. You have absolutely no evidence to prove this." And I thought, I don't mind being challenged. I get challenged all the time, but I thought, wow, that's an interesting that's an interesting thing to, like, just draw a line in the sand and say digital transformations do not have a high failure rate. So I think just being aware of the risk is really the key thing, and I think that's what the BS detectors and some of the other things that you guys address, I think is so important. Um,
Yep.
So want to turn to the audience here. Thanks for everyone for joining or dropping in the chat where you're from today. We do have people from all over the world. We've got someone from Brandon from Barcelona, Spain. We have Julio from Italy. Dennis from India. So just a few examples of where people are joining from today. Thank you for being here. And then a two-part comment from Tim on LinkedIn. He says that you guys are old, but then he backpedals a bit and says, not old, but experienced. So thank you for that,
Mm.
Tim. That's what I prefer to think. Seasoned veterans, experienced. That sounds a lot better than old.
And Tim, thanks for the comments about transparency too. And I think that honestly applies to all of us.
Yeah,
So we
yeah,
gotta keep working on it. It's not something that you wake up in the morning and it's sorted. You have to recommit to that every day.
yeah, absolutely. And Tim says, I like the transparency on diginomica.com. It's a breath of fresh air, hard to find elsewhere. It's a great comment there. Um, so I guess just to start then, and you started to talk about one maybe potential answer to this question when you were talking about the higher refined BS detectors that people seem to have or the buyers seem to have nowadays. Well, how else would you describe, your general perception of sort of the state of the union of the enterprise tech space right now? You've been covering this for well beyond the 10 years, by the way. I mean, as you mentioned, you started doing this back in the 90s, but so what have you seen over the last, I don't want to say what have you seen over the last 25 years, but how
Mm.
how are things now versus how they were in the past? I mean, what's the good, the bad, the ugly?
Gosh, it's such a mixed bag. I mean, I think I already I already touched on. I think one of the positives around the opportunity for us to be more networked and be smarter. And I talk about that in the context of like networks of trust, I guess you could call it. Um, those are so important. And unfortunately, I think we're also contending with a lot of difficulties in the form of so much technology hype, especially around AI, that threatens to really muddy the conversation of how to be successful as a company. And on the one hand, I guess that's good for us because we can spend a lot of time on Diginomica trying to get to the bottom of that. I mean,
Mm,
one thing that I think is sort of interesting is that while technology is far from perfect, it is much better than it was. And and I think the interesting thing about that is that it really then highlights the people and process and business model issues that are messed up and that need to be fixed, because it's a lot harder to blame the technology than it was even 10 years ago. Now, look, you can still select the wrong stuff, you can configure it wrong, you can have, and that's a big theme of your site, is helping to understand the decision process and the importance of it. So you can still go down that road the wrong way, but generally, if you pick the right partner, which is also really important, and you pick the right software, there's a lot you can do. I mean, I talk in terms of this notion of continuous everything, like that the whole point of enterprise software, I think, ultimately is to have deeper continuous visibility into all of our operations and projects. So you could take that in almost any area, like in HR, for example, performance reviews. Like instead of once a year you sit down with someone, by then it's probably too late to address the reasons why they're leaving your company or why they've had a falling out with their boss. Like you want to have that more regular loop, and in every part of the industry there's something like that. In manufacturing, it's machines, and you don't want your machines to go down, you want to predict that, you know and so I think the technology to achieve these things has never been better. So that part is the good part. The bad part is that it was never a technology problem in the first place. It was a people
yeah,
problem, it was a process problem, it was a change problem, as you've described so many times. And so in a way it almost sort of brings that more into focus, that we got to solve these other things. And then, like I said, there's a whole different conversation around AI and just what I consider to be absolutely insanely heightened expectations around what AI can deliver that I think are really out of whack, especially when you look at the state of data and the health of data in most large enterprises. They're not ready to, even if the AI tools are super wonderful, amazing, their data's not ready.
right. Yeah, that's interesting. I want to come back to the AI comment too. I know you've got some pretty strong thoughts on generative AI and the pros and cons of that. But before I come back to that, though, one thing I wanted to ask you too is you alluded to all these changes in the technology space and how things have changed so fast and so much for the better in many ways. But to your point, it was never about the technology. It's always been about the people and process. Why why is it that we're changing? If you look at the three layers here, people, process, technology, technology is moving at a breakneck speed. It's constantly getting better and improving and providing more capabilities. Why is that moving so much faster than people and process abilities to change? Why do you think that is?
I don't know. People are people struggle with change. People struggle fundamentally with change, It has always been. Um, with software, there's just been so much acceleration in terms of things like cloud sensibilities, DevOps sensibilities, APIs. This notion that software needs to be able to play nicer with its peers, so that and of course there are problems with that too. You can wind up with very heterogeneous landscapes that are difficult to manage, which I think you have written about at times. And cloud software is not always as mature as it should be in certain ways, but the model is just so much better because um, it's about reducing technical debt that prevents you from moving fast, and part of it is just the way the world is right now, like the circumstances behind political events, behind supply chain disruptions. You just cannot afford to be slow to respond to those things, and I think that's put a lot of pressure on the technology vendors to get these things sorted. But at the same time, I don't know, like it's just that like change is so complicated, and when you're really good at using a certain set of tools, it's understandable why you wouldn't want to just put those tools aside for other stuff, and it's not necessarily in the interests of the employee to embrace what the overall business strategy is. And I think that's where a lot of the tension comes in, is like, let's face it, a lot of businesses don't really look after their employees in such a way that would make them want to invest in the broader change. They just
Mhm.
they don't give them a sense that there's enough opportunity there to do that. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess an organization is a lot like an organism. It's something that slowly evolves and morphs and changes over time, and it grows and it gets built, and then that's happening over years and decades or whatever. And then over here, you've got technology, and I can create technology to do all kinds of things a lot faster than that organization took to get to wherever it is. And then those two worlds collide. It ends up creating sort of an explosion in many ways, or at least some sort of fireworks and conflict along the way.
yeah, and throw into the mix all the mergers and acquisitions. I mean, you know yourself how disruptive that can be from a systems and change standpoint. So even if you think you've got a lot figured out, now you've been acquired or you're acquiring somebody, they have a different technical landscape than you. It's pretty obvious to see where the problems are going to be there.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Um, so you mentioned here, you started to talk about AI a moment ago. And there's two things I wanted to cover here. One is, I guess getting back to Diginomica for a second. You talk about, or you've shared with me that you have a no generative AI in our writing policy. Tell us about that. Why is that? You're not, so in other words, you're not using AI at all to write your content. Is that correct?
Not We're not using generative AI to write copy, and we've said we're not going to do it, and we don't plan to do it, and we said we're never going to do it. I guess there's a statute of limitations 5, 10 years from now or whatever, but
Right.
we just felt this was paramount to reader trust, to tell readers that robots aren't writing the copy that you read on this website. And um, part of that is a response to the way that people are going to use that type of content to do SEO gaming, and and try to create like fake pages and stuff. And we just wanted to say these are real humans writing real stuff. And it wasn't necessarily to say that you should never use generative AI for content. I mean, I see a lot of use cases, for example, in marketing and different things, where some of that may be actually useful as a starting point and stuff like that. And there are people that actually have challenges writing, where I think staring at a blank page can be intimidating, and there's examples I think where it can help with that too. But we're writers, so we have to get over that. and
Right.
um, and we did make the point that we still encourage our writers to use such tools in various capacities. I mean, I use Grammarly, I use Otter for machine transcripts, so it's not like there's already an AI enablement of the process going on. But we just wanted to really put a stake in the ground for reader trust, and for readers to know that humans are writing this content, and it wasn't necessarily judging other people as much as saying, look, this isn't happening here. And it was interesting because at the time I couldn't find anyone that had made a similar statement, and then I think about a month later the Financial Times did. So I felt like that was pretty good company, and I don't think they followed our lead or anything like that. And there'll probably be a couple other publications that do it, but it's interesting because media is such a threatened entity from the industry standpoint that I think media is very cautious about. They don't want to overstep and say we're not going to use this, and then later come back and say we did. So, but anyway, we made a
Yeah.
commitment to it.
Interesting. So that sort of explains, which is a really interesting stance, by the way, as it relates to generative AI and the lack of use of it intentionally for Diginomica. But what about when it comes to some of the buyers that read your publication and that you interact with day to day, and they're really hyped and amped about AI? You talked earlier about how there's so
Mm.
much hype around AI and so much excitement around it, which is great. It's a great. I mean, I'm excited about it. I imagine you might be a little bit excited about it too, but you always temper that enthusiasm with sort of the dose of reality. What is that dose of reality, and sort of what are you seeing as it relates to AI and enterprise buyers?
Well, it was interesting because one of the things that became a little bit controversial about that statement is I think we then had to explain a little further that we actually are enthusiastic about some of these use cases. And, you know, one of the interesting things about generative AI is how many different use cases it has across different industries and scenarios. And we do find those interesting. And even from an image creation standpoint, we haven't ruled it out for our site. Look, I mean, we use stock photos. These are not the most incredible photos in the world. I would not be rule out that we would use that for imaging in the future. But so I think there's a few different things with AI. I think we have to be a little bit careful because from an enterprise standpoint, there's a lot of issues around uh, the flaws in these tools around things like explainability, data privacy. If you do, there's IP lawsuits going on right now. I think the tools aren't really ready for enterprise use cases yet, for the most part, and that's going to play out over the next year or so. So one cautionary point is that the tools aren't quite ready yet, and so I worry a little bit that as a result of that, we're going to obscure other things. Like, so for example, at a recent show, it took me a while to get with a customer. I'm talking with them, and it turns out that they have this pretty amazing robotics that are doing some really cool stuff on their shop floor and have helped them close their talent gap because they had all these open positions. And this is a classic manufacturing problem: is just can't find enough talent. And I was like, why wasn't this robotics thing on the keynote stage? And it's like, well, because it's suddenly robotics isn't like sexy anymore. I'm like, what kind of world are we living in where we're obscuring these really fundamentally important things that customers are doing that are actually like more mature and ready? So I think we have to be a little mindful of that. Like, and then from a precision standpoint, we just really have to understand that these tools are massively overhyped, and while they're good at certain things, the generative AI emerges from a very specific kind of deep learning that I've been studying quite intensely, and it actually doesn't understand what it's saying, and it's really really important to know that because that requires a lot of thinking around human in the loop scenarios and making sure that for example, maybe 90% accuracy in certain scenarios is good enough for you because
Mm.
because you're going to take that copy and then fix it. Or there's other scenarios where, okay, we're going to train only on this particular data set, and then we're going to generate job descriptions, for example, which is one interesting scenario. So it requires a lot more precision, and that's in general like what the light bulbs that have gone off for me looking ahead to the next 10 years of Diginomica is that I want us to really try to be incredibly precise on Diginomica about what technology can and cannot do, because vendors are terrible about saying what things can't do. They want to
Right.
make you think that everything is possible and this you can do this, and oh, well, you can't do that right now, but when we expand the parameters and the training sets, then we will be able to do these. It's like it's untapped, and it's like, well, actually no, it's not untapped. It actually is a flaw with this form of AI, and that's not going to get fixed. But on the other hand, problems like things like explainability, in other words, like where did the AI come up with this answer? Those things can get solved, and so I think there's some really good opportunity there. So let's just be a lot more precise in our conversation. Why should we be precise? Because we want to have more successful projects, and that's sort of the connection that I make between why I'm grouchy about this stuff versus what I really want, which is I want to write about successful projects, not crappy projects. I'll leave the
Yeah.
crappy projects to you, man.
I don't want to talk about it either, to be honest, or write about it. But I'd rather be talking about the successes and how great everything is, and really be searching hard for those little nooks and crannies of failure. But unfortunately, organizations tend to make those, a lot of those same mistakes. And I think you're right. It does. A lot of this does come back to the industry. I think we have the industry ourselves, we have ourselves to blame for that. I mean, even though I know you and I are sort of running counter to the mainstream of the industry, but this industry creates that mismanaged expectation, and it creates those blind spots. And I think the industry should really take a long, hard look at themselves and saying, long term, is this really the right way for us to be, to grow our businesses and to make the, technical landscape more successful? And I would challenge, or I would argue that that's not the way we're doing things now. Is not the best way, for sure.
A lot of interesting comments in the chat, dude.
Yeah, I'm
A lot
actually,
of good stuff there.
yeah. Here's one from let's see, one that kind of ties to a comment you made before this discussion. So I'm going to pull this question from Laik. I don't know if I can pull the whole thing on here. I'll start it and then I'll probably have to hide it. But it says, Laik on LinkedIn says, I use proofreading and grammar correction for that purpose, but I completely understand your point. It can be frustrating to come across a lot of content written by content writers and generated by robots, flooding the internet on all platforms. How do we address this issue? And maybe I'll add another part of it is, how do you address this whole potential for sort of fake news and the, in many ways, the enterprise technology vendors could potentially use AI to further perpetuate this echo chamber of inaccurate information, incomplete information, I guess you'd say, in other words, highlighting the strengths and how great things are versus here's the reality and here's the risk and here's the blind spot. So how do we navigate that, knowing that we have tools in place now that could maybe make things even worse for some of those dynamics we're worried about?
Right. And I've written in Diginomica about whether the enterprise has a fake news problem, and you can do a search for that and see a couple of my past articles, and I'll write about it again. It's a really important question, and a really good distinction in that comment between AI enabled tools that help us write better versus stuff that actually generates copy, which is deeply flawed at this point, but can be useful for certain things. It's just like, the bottom line is that in our industry, we need human experts to have successful projects, and we need the voices of those experts in order to do that. And so there's two different things here, because I study the role of AI in disinformation, and disinformation was not started by AI. And there's a lot of quote unquote disinformation in the enterprise software market already before AI generated content, in the form of a lot of propaganda from technology firms that isn't necessarily, accurate in terms of what it's going to be like on your project. So on the cultural side, I'm very concerned about disinformation, and I think that we have reason to be, but that's sort of a separate conversation from today. On the enterprise side, I am concerned about it, but the one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that if you buy into bad information generated by, I don't care whether it's AI or whether it's bad vendor marketing copy written by a human, because let's face it, some of that content is pretty bad also.
Right.
If you fall for that stuff, you are going to have an unsuccessful project. You're going to make bad decisions and you're going to fail. And that's going to hurt your project, and it's going to hurt your career. So my hope for our industry, Eric, is that we have to overcome this to be successful, and that gives us motivation to get a handle on these problems. How are we going to do that? Well, it's going to be a variety of things. It's going to be self-education. It's going to be talking to your peers. It's going to be, like I said, honing that BS detector, finding trusted sources of information. Hopefully you would consider us one. We'll see. Folks like what you're doing. Surrounding yourself with people who have different informed views that make you think. That's what it's all about. And that's one thing that really gives me hope for our industry, is that there is still a respect for expertise and experience, and trying to get a handle on that. At the same time, I think our industry battles with problems around inclusion and diversity that are very concerning and very deep as well, and we have to tackle those. So don't get me wrong, those are important, but I don't have a lot of faith in AI to solve that particular diversity problem. In fact, a lot of these training sets are not very diversely sourced or trained.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And what about, there's a comment here from Tim on LinkedIn, and he makes a comment here about AI. That he says, I'd like to point out that many U.S. companies are still manually entering AP invoices into their ERP. Lowering that percentage with AI would be more amazing to me than any new AI use cases. it's such a basic application of AI, but it's still such a green territory in terms of adoption. So sort of like, with all the potential and all these different ways we could be using AI, um, it seems as though organizations aren't yet fully, they're not even mature yet in some of the real basic fundamental uses of AI and machine learning within that. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, 100%. And Tim plays exactly to the point I was making earlier about how we let the next generation of technology obscure what's possible now. And I've been doing a series on automation vendors. I have another one coming up, an interview with Rob Enslin, co-CEO of UiPath. And we didn't talk that much about quote unquote AI, but we talked a lot about automating workflows. And and the really cool thing that kind of does make me a little optimistic in the 10-year window. I'm not going to speak to what could happen eventually with machines and intelligence, but in the 10-year window, the reason I'm optimistic is because human talent is so hard to find right now that we need all the automation we can get. And at Tim's point, a lot of that automation technology is already there, and there's a lot of broken and manual processes that deeply need to be addressed. And so that's the kind of work that companies should be doing right now, along with what I've described earlier that someone had a question about as far as getting your data platform together. But some of that stuff seems like, oh, that's not very sexy. Well, I don't know, man. If you're stuck doing manual invoice entry all day, like getting that off your plate is pretty damn sexy. Like
Yeah.
especially if your employer has a better role in mind for you. And that's the thing we have to be really careful about with this stuff because it can be used as a headcount reduction exercise. And what I'm really hoping is that the smarter companies are going to prove that that's a stupid, arrogant, and self-defeating way to do business, and the better way is to free up your people to do more high value tasks. And that's what I'm hoping the role of automation will be.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And back to your point earlier about how the problem has never been with the technology. You look at all these possibilities and how fast the use cases for AI are accelerating, but yet, to Tim's point, there's just some really basic fundamental ways and low hanging fruits you could be deploying now to leverage it without having to boil the ocean. I think a lot of organizations get overwhelmed by the thought of AI right now, but to Tim's point, you don't need to take on AI across the entire enterprise. You could start with something as simple as AP processing, something that,
Exactly.
yeah, maybe it is or isn't sexy. We could argue that all day, I suppose, but it does add value. It delivers an ROI potentially if you do
Preach,
it right.
Tim, preach. You nailed it.
Now, speaking of ERP and maybe shifting away from AI potentially a little bit here, here's a question from Julio on LinkedIn, and Julio asked the question of, um, what is the current, what is your opinion of the current ERP ecosystem as of today, and how does it contrast with 10 years ago, and how do you think it will evolve in the next 10 years? So, just looking at the ERP software space, how are things
Wow.
different today, and where's it headed? What are your thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I think if you look at ERP vendors now, they're all emphasizing like a more modern platform and modern approach. And I think mostly that's a good thing because, you know, the ERP of the past was all based on helping companies do a lot of customization of their code base in ways that trap them on older releases. And Eric, you and I could have a really interesting debate. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time to do a full one today on when to customize and when not to. But in general, I'm going to make the argument that that was a bad exercise enabled by greedy systems integrators that took
Mm,
all the work that they could get from that without ever really thinking about where this would all end up. And fortunately, now that's changing. And even companies that offer on-premise ERP, for example, in asset-intensive industries and stuff like that, where there's a lot of regulations, are still talking to their customers around the dangers of over-customizing their code base.
mm,
And and the whole idea behind that is we need to be more quote unquote agile going forward than we have been in the past. But in general, I think what we're going to see is transactional systems of record are going to become a commodity. That's not the key. And you're already seeing it. It's already a trend that's happening. The whole thing is like, how do I pull meaningful data out of these systems to make better decisions, to serve customers better? We have to, ERP was very inward focused. We have to look much more externally now, connecting to supplier networks. Like sometimes now we're accountable for what our second tier suppliers do, not even our first tier, but our second tier in certain regulatory environments in Europe, for example. we need different software for that purpose. And I think that's really pushing ERP vendors, and maybe will even make room for some upstart players in some cases. Now, we have a long way to go here. But the one thing I will say is I think the service industry needs to evolve, because I think the software industry has evolved better than the service industry. And the service industry is still operating mostly on legacy playbooks. And I'd like to see a
Mm,
lot more differentiation around helping customers with true advisory, pushing back and not just saying, oh, the customer's always right, we're going to build a bunch of customizations for the customer. Pushing back and say, here's how we're going to win going forward, and here's how we're going to keep your platform modern. Oh, and by the way, like more independent voices, which is like a big thing that I advocate, which is, why are we so dependent on one firm to lead us down a particular path of services? Like, why don't we have more independents in there who can come and do various audits and gut checks on projects? And no, Eric didn't ask me to say this, because Eric does do this work, but I've studied this from multiple angles, and the best projects have more independent voices at the table and not just one prime vendor. And so I like to think that the industry is evolving away a little bit from that. But let's be honest, like, this isn't going to change overnight.
right. And as long as the economic incentives are still there for you to potentially do something that conflicts with clients' best interests, that's always going to be a challenge. I mean, I don't know how you fix that. I don't know if it'll ever get regulated or whatever. But to your point, like with customization, yeah, I mean, if I'm a software vendor, I could tell you all day, like, yeah, don't customize. But in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking, well, although it will help me if you customize, that's going to add 3 months to this project and another
Right.
$500,000 of billable revenue or whatever. You can't help but think that we're all human, right? So I think that's the
Absolutely.
tricky part of this.
Yeah, you have to redo your business model, but there's a lot of SaaS consulting firms that serve SaaS vendors that have figured out that renewals and subscriptions are a pretty nice business model also.
Yeah.
And ideally what that means is you're earning the business every year by proving you're still relevant and successful. So I like that model so much better. You can debate whether multi-tenant cloud, maybe that's not good for everything, but the point is that model of staying invested in a customer's success year after year is so much better than, oh, the old days of like, high fives, we took your ERP project live, now let's go walk away and like on to the next project, and good luck with your ERP and like trying to compete in 21st century business. Yeah, that's going to work great. But I
Right.
think one interesting thing going forward, if you look ahead 10 years, if indeed we do realize some of the potential of AI, like, so for example, I talked with a partner at IBM who's a friend of mine who says, I don't really go into my HR system anymore because IBM's got some pretty advanced generative stuff based on how Watson's evolved. He says, I just tell my HR, like, provision this employee, and it goes and provisions this employee. And so that's still limited, but imagine that, like, in a lot of scenarios in enterprise software, right, where you're like, hey, can you configure this product in this region, or can you tell me if I need to shift workloads to this different facility, blah blah blah. And I think that's really interesting, because I think now we're starting to get away from product categories, because I'm not in my ERP system anymore, I'm not in my CRM system anymore, I'm just asking my system to do shit for me. And I
Right.
don't want to hear, for example, about licenses. I don't want to hear, well, sorry, I can't answer that question because you don't have the right product license for this. And personally, I think a lot of this stuff's really refreshing, because I don't know about you, but I get the magic quadrants and Forrester waves and all this stuff, tracking all these product categories and stuff. I don't really think that's where customers' heads are at anymore. I understand why you need to do that to a point, but there's a point at which it's like, I'm just trying to solve business problems. I don't care what product category I'm using. And so if I look ahead 5, 10 years, I look at the erosion of product categories like ERP and supply chain and CRM. And I look at a focus on workflows, automation, solving problems, making it easy for me to interact with these systems, and just focus on the customer, focus on getting the job done.
Right. Now, do you think, and I apologize if this is a hard question for you to ask because I may be picking on one or more of your
No, go
advertisers or
ahead.
sponsors a bit, but do you think ten years from now, do you think we'll have the same big ERP vendors sort of like dominating the market with SAP, Oracle, Microsoft, Oracle NetSuite? Do you think it'll be the same players, or do you think that it's going to look totally different in 10 years from now in terms of who the leaders are in the space?
Well, like I said, I think the transactional layer is going to recede in importance and become a commodity, and that's going to threaten a number of these vendors. Some of them are going to
Hmm.
reinvent and survive the transition. There's still a big advantage to being a big software company right now when you look at the importance of data, for example, in the new scenarios, having all that data, having that huge footprint, and customers are inherently a little conservative. It's going to take a long time to play out, but I think you're going to see some of these players, they're not going to go away, but they're going to have a perceived, they're going to be less and less perceived as totally relevant. Like they're going to be perceived more and more like, ah, yeah, we run that, but that's not who we go to when we want to talk about what's next for our business and transformation. So, you see how this happens in our industry where at one point IBM was considered cutting edge, and now obviously it's trying to reinvent, but the point is it's not the first firm out of your lips when you think what's the most cutting edge firm in software today, right?
Right.
So firms have a way of sticking around, but maybe they lose a little bit of their cachet of being a front line. We have to keep a close eye on the hyperscalers, like because the Amazons, the Googles, and the Microsofts, I think they're going to have a lot to say about the future of this industry because of the power of those infrastructure models. And I'm not
Hmm.
sure that's necessarily a good thing because I don't think this is going to be a real startup friendly industry in a lot of ways. But I think we'll probably see a few vendors like the Workdays that emerged into prominence. I think we'll see a few like that, but it's actually not going to be too easy because the these AI models are all about data volume and running at massive scale, and I think that makes it difficult for startups.
Yeah, that's really well said and great points on the hyperscaling and the importance of data. That, in fact, that was one of our questions from Kyler on LinkedIn. Had a question too about that, which I'll come back to that question in a second here, time permitting. But before I do that, I wanted to get to one of the comments you and I were exchanging an email thread about preparing for this discussion. And if you don't mind, I'm going to read one comment in your email verbatim because I feel like you said it better than I can paraphrase it. But you said in here, one of your suggestions was to discuss why you're increasingly agitated about buzzword overuse and your push for precision and clarity, and why that's so important to buyers. And that's one thing I think you and I really connected early on in our, running in parallel universes here early on in our, back in the early 2000s. It was our both of our distaste for buzzwords. I
Mhm.
think that was something that you and I have shared pretty strongly, and we're pretty well aligned on that. But tell us what you mean by that. Why do buzzwords agitate you, and how can vendors be more clear in their marketing and their messaging to the market?
I'll keep the answer fairly short because I think we've covered some of this, but I think vendors are, like I said, vendors are really bad at saying what something doesn't do.
Mm,
And actually, that's what customers really need to hear in order to understand what something does do. You have to understand what it can't do. And vendors really don't like to talk about that. So you and I need to.
right.
And in general, you know, most of the buzzwords in our industry actually do have some relevance. It's just that they require so much more precision in order to understand. And what I came to understand is that making fun of buzzwords is healthy because whether it's blockchain or low code or whatever, because then we can scratch underneath it and figure out like, okay, first of all, is low code really new? Well, not really. We've had rapid application development environments for 20 years.
Mm,
So what is new about this? And one of the best ones was a couple of my friends, Vijay Sanka and Esteban Kolsky, years ago. They got into a debate about change management versus digital transformation. And long story short, Esteban got really insulted because Vijay was saying that change management and digital transformation were the same thing. And Esteban was like, no, they absolutely are not. And they had this big argument about that. But I think it was a really, really healthy discussion because that is an important point, right? Like we need to
mhm.
understand, like, and I actually think they are different, but like you've been writing a lot about digital transformation and reading lately and like the failures and some really good blogs. And one of the things that I was like, if Eric and I had an hour, it'd be really fun to really pick apart what digital transformation means and what does failure in a digital transformation context mean, because this is all really important because a lot of times I think what you refer to as digital transformation failure, I would refer to as ERP project failure. I would say that actually wasn't a genuine transformation to begin with. That
Mm,
was an ERP project dressed up in transformation language. And so I always want to really encourage companies to take a broader look at transformation and to do it outside the context of software choices, but to look more at where's our industry going, where's our business going, where are our customers going, how are we going to be able to be competitive 5, 10, 15 years out, and not have a product conversation at that point. And And I think if you do that, I think it's really hard to fail actually, because even if you stumble, you're having the right collective conversation. But the problem is that so often they just attach digital transformation to a software implementation. And that I have a huge problem with. And I'm not surprised those underperform and fail. Anyway,
Right.
that's just
Yeah.
one example. But we could do that with almost any term in our industry and have a great discussion. We could sure as hell do it with blockchain and stuff like that. But the one thing I would say is the big difference between blockchain, Web3, metaverse, and AI is that AI is surging on the backs of massive consumer adoption. And that's why we have to talk about it, because it's here, it's real. A lot of employees are using these tools improperly, shadow AI, we call it. But when 90% of your developers and 90% of your marketers are playing around with these tools, you better hone in on this problem. So that's why we're talking about it so much.
Yeah, absolutely. That you just gave me a great idea that maybe you could be a guest on in this discussion, which is sort of battle of the buzzwords. Let's unpack each of these best
Yeah, exactly.
practices. You mentioned low code best practices. Even cloud. You look at the word cloud. I mean, that's sort of a buzzword. It's highly effective, but it's not new. I mean, you had ASP
Right.
back 25 years ago, but ASP doesn't sound nearly as good as cloud. So cloud was just a
And
much
it's
better
really not
word.
a cloud, right? It's in someone's data center somewhere, right?
Right. Right.
So,
Exactly.
you could have a lot of discussions around that. And I think discussing what true SaaS characteristics are is a really interesting discussion also in terms of what are the true advantages of those economies of scale and why do they matter. But, those are examples that you could literally spend an hour on each of those topics and they could be very informative.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to do is turn that mischief and my irritation into a way to have better products and better results. So that's how I made the connection.
Yeah, and it's a great point that it's worth having these conversations of, I'll pick on best practices. Let's talk about best practices. Are they really best practices? Not because I want to be a naysayer and just totally go against what the rest of the industry is saying, but because you have to understand what that really means. What do best practices really mean? And what are the pros and the cons of that? And if we sit here and just focus on just the
Totally.
great things, it's not going to be healthy for any of us if all we do is focus on the good side of it versus the downside risk of what we're going up against.
Yeah, actually, one very quick aside. About 10 years ago, before my Diginomica colleague Dan Hallett retired, he went on a rant about best practices and said there are no best practices. I thought about it and I decided never to use best practices in my writing again. And I haven't used it in 10 years since he
Yeah,
went on that rant. And
that's
it's not
smart.
that it's not that that word never has use, but I just decided not to use it because I was like, it's the kind of word that makes you more comfortable after you use it, like you just said something useful, and I'm not sure it's useful.
Right.
So I
I
think it may be more useful to say that every company needs to examine existing methodologies and find the best one for them,
right.
But I don't
Yeah.
know.
It's a word I do occasionally still use it, but every time I do, I cringe a little bit and I do
Yeah.
feel dirty, like I need to take a shower, like you were saying earlier. It's every time I use the word best practice. But I agree
Yeah.
with you. I think it's worth diving into and really asking the questions and the tough questions and turning to the independent voices like Diginomica, like Third Stage and others out there. And I think, and over time, I think there'll be more and more independent voices. It's certainly more. It seems like there's more independent voices now than there were 10 or 20 years ago. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, in some ways, yes. I mean, I think there's been a rise of so many people with their own voices in this industry, which I think is really welcome. I think that it's a longer conversation, but I think the analyst side of our industry still could use a lot more upstarts. And
Yeah.
we try to reinvent media. I'd be interested now in trying to reinvent the analyst game a little bit. That's a longer conversation also,
Hmm.
because I spend a lot of time with analysts and I see a lot of problems with how those business models are conducted right now in terms of customers' best interest. But the one thing I am a little bit worried about, and I'm worried about this from a consumer citizen standpoint as well as an enterprise standpoint, is the degree to which AI enabled search stuff that's coming out around generative stuff is going to hurt the visibility of people like you and me and hurt the more outside voices, because what this sort of inline search is all about is saying that Google or wherever you're searching has the answers, and those answers are going to be encapsulated in this like smaller thing. It's less about linking out to experts, and I really worry about the future of our industry when expert voices are obscured, and it feels like the big danger going forward is to revert back to a handful of voices that control the conversation. And unwittingly, I think these AI tools could lead us back into that. Now, there are some really good ways of combating that. And I think, for example, building our own networks is a big part of that. In building, in my book on reaching the informed buyer, which, by the way, is free on Diginomica if you want to read it, or you can just read the blogs for free too if you don't want to sign up for it. But I talk about these different models, and the model that I embrace is the model of the opt-in community. And that's kind of what you're building around your business. And so that provides you some protection against some of these AI machinations because people subscribe to you, and at least now you have a direct pipeline into those people going forward. Um, and so to me, companies and our industry as a whole runs a real risk there of overlooking that machines actually aren't gonna necessarily gonna refer us to outside experts because they want to pretend like they're the experts when they're interacting with us. But in fact, they've been trained on expert content. They've been trained on your site. They've been trained on my site. And they're actually appropriating our expertise, but they don't know what they're saying. That's a big problem. So I'm worried about that, but I also really like the fact that we can build our own platforms and have, we're having this great conversation today with all this excellent chat without any adult supervision in the room, like,
Right.
so that's great. And I think that's good for the people in the audience who have been fantastic during this conversation, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. No, that's really well said. And what is it that, looking at sort of how the industry has evolved and changed and where it's headed in the future and all the things there are to be excited about and also things that it is important to be cautious of. What sort of closing advice would you have for enterprise tech buyers that are launching an ERP implementation and or some sort of digital transformation?
Yeah, I actually made a list of those, and so I'm gonna refresh my memory here because I think this was interesting.
And while you're pulling that up,
Um,
by the way, I shared your link to your ebook in the chat
oh,
here,
thank you.
so be sure to check
Yeah,
that out
yeah,
too.
yeah. And if you, like I said, if you don't want to do the sign up form, you can. There's a lot of blog posts because this was ultimately based on a bunch of blogs I did. So my closing advice, and again, Eric had no influence on this. Um, my closing advice is keep your BS detectors sharp. Come up for air more often. I find that the customers having the most success are always interacting. They're interacting with their peers. They're forming so-called trust networks of diverse voices, including especially other customers, but also anyone that has good insights. They're consuming that all the time. The When you get two heads down on your projects, you're not going to get as good a result as if you have more of a habit of coming up for air and getting gut checks. Most of the projects that Eric writes about that fall apart, there were multiple opportunities along the way to correct those before they reach that point. And so finding a way to come up for error is big. Another really big one is I call it buzzword boomerang, but churning the buzzwords back onto the vendors. And customer success is my favorite because every vendor is pushing customer success right now. So take them up on that and say, let's have a customer success conversation about how my product's going to be successful. And it's all about measuring the right KPIs. And both those things are important. You have to measure stuff, but it's got to be the right stuff. And everyone involved with your projects, to some extent, has to agree on what those metrics are going to be. That's not an easy thing because service providers and SIs have their own set of criteria. It can be hard to get everyone on the same page. But if vendors are going to push this customer success conversation, I say take it, appropriate it, and push it back on them with your definition of success and see if you can agree to that. And if you can't, then why would you go forward with such a project under those circumstances? But
Right.
if you could, and you could have someone like yourself sitting there, if you could have a customer sitting there, a partner sitting there, vendor, everyone agrees on what the success criteria are going to be and how you're going to measure and track them. I really like where that goes. And I would like to see vendors, by the way, devote a lot more technology to project monitoring, the same amount that they devote to other stuff. But that's a whole different conversation. So yeah, and again, just be careful with tech hype, especially around generative AI in particular. And don't use tools like this as headcount reduction exercises.
Mm.
Use them to increase diversity. Like for example, we didn't even have this conversation. But the other thing I'm really excited about is the potential for remote work and collaboration tools to actually tap into talent that's been excluded from participating in the enterprise because they can't come into the office because they're looking after an aging relative, or they're in another country, or they have various commitments with their health that they can't. and like using that technology to tap into talent is really exciting as well. That's one of the things I'm most excited about, is challenging this oppressive notion that we all have to be in the office in order to like to be functional corporate citizens. I think that's a really, and then that's those same companies say we can't find talent. It's like, well, yeah, the talent's out there, you just don't know how to tap into it. And so I'm really wanting to encourage customers to say, let's use these tools to create talent. And then people say, oh, well, we can't do that because, remote has all these disadvantages. It's like, well, have you really looked at all the opportunities here, for example, to have collaborative work, co-working spaces close to where those people are so they can actually meet? Like, it doesn't have to be all remote. It's just like, let's use these tools in a more creative way. So that's my other big talking point for customers, is to figure out how to do that.
Wow, that's a lot. That's now you should, is this an article we could find on your
I've
website?
written a lot about remote work in the past. Yeah.
Okay. Well, even
Yeah.
just this overall thread of recommendations to enterprise tech buyers in 2023 and beyond, is that it sounds like it could be an article.
You just gave me an idea for an article, Eric, because I just wrote all these bullet points for you. And I'll turn that into an article. Why not? And I can source this conversation and be like, Eric inspired me to do this, and we'll do it.
And you gave me the idea for what'd you call it? What was the buzzword? Not buzzword bingo, buzzword
Boomerang effect.
Buzzword boomerang. That's right.
Yeah, it's like,
boomerang.
Be careful those buzzwords; they're going to come back and smack you.
So you gave me an idea for a video or a blog or both or something.
There you go. Yeah.
No, I love it.
Redefine that on your own terms.
Yeah, exactly. It'd be a great debate too. I like that idea. Well, great. Well, appreciate you being here today. This is a great conversation, a lot of fun, and I would love to have you back again. And maybe the buzzword angle is a good way to go, because we both have that shared passion, or lack thereof, for buzzwords. So thank you for being here. And how can people connect with you other than Diginomica? What's the best way to connect and follow your stuff?
Well, LinkedIn's obviously a good way. Diginomica is my home base. I have also Twitter, if you like Twitter. I noticed there were a few questions we didn't get to. If you want to ping me on LinkedIn, I'll be happy to answer those questions. We try to get to a lot of them, but there were a lot surged at the end there. Just find me on those platforms. Happy to continue the dialogue. And this is just one session, but hopefully we'll keep doing it. Maybe I'll have Eric on my show again soon, and we'll take it from there.
Sounds great. Well, thank you for being here, Jon. Really appreciate it. Again, it's Diginomica, Diginomca. I should probably. I know how to spell it. Just saying it out loud is a little more difficult, so I'll show it on the screen.
Yeah, we maybe made a mistake in our naming, but it's too late now, man. 10
Right.
years.
The good news is I don't ever have to spell it, because I just type DIG and it just defaults to Diginomica and
Cool.
on my browser. So diginomica.com, check it out. It's a great website. A lot of edgy stuff. The weekly emails you guys send out are really good too. What do you call it? The Jon, it comes out under your name.
Enterprise hits and misses, and then we send out a weekly. Yeah, that's my attempt to kind of give you a digest of the opinionated review of the week in the enterprise. That's always fun.
Yeah, it's very, very well written and entertaining too. That's a good thing. It's not academic. It's not like reading most stuff out there. And not only because you're honest and transparent and authentic and all that good stuff, but also just the way you guys write is very unique, and I enjoy it myself. So be sure to check that out.
Much appreciated.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you to the audience for being here. Again, this live stream happens every Tuesday. The live stream end result, the recording, becomes part of the Transformation Ground Control podcast. Be sure to check that out on Google and Amazon and Apple Podcasts, all the podcast platforms. You can find it there every Wednesday. You can also find it streaming to LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter too. So be sure to check us out. Thank you for being here today. Hope you all have a great week, and we'll see you next time on the Digital Transformation live stream. Take care, and thanks again, Jon.
Thanks all.
All right, take care.